You think you know the sound of World War II. You think it's just the rattle of a Thompson or that iconic ping of the M1 Garand. Think again. History is written by the victors, and the history of firearms is usually written about the survivors. The AK-47s, the AR-15s, the Garands. But before those legends cemented their place on the mantle, there was a chaotic, messy, and violent period of experimentation. There were other monsters out there, rifles that were ahead of their time, or perhaps just too dangerous for their own good. Some were mechanical masterpieces, others were desperate last-ditch efforts to stop an invading army. Today we aren't talking about the poster boys of the war, we're digging up the graves of the forgotten. These are the semi-automatic rifles that history left behind, but make no mistake, they were absolutely deadly. Let's set the stage. It's the early 20th century. The world is still obsessed with the bolt-action rifle. One trigger pull, one manual cycle of the bolt. It was slow, it was deliberate, and if you missed your shot while a trench raider was charging you with a bayonet, it was a death sentence. But in the back rooms of armories from Mexico City to Stockholm, engineers were chasing a different dream, the self-loading rifle. Firepower without the fuss. Getting a semi-auto to work on a clean shooting range is one thing. Getting it to work in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front or the humid rot of the Pacific is another. Most failed, but a select few actually worked. We have to start the journey with the pioneer. And no, it didn't come from the United States, and it didn't come from Germany. The first semi-automatic rifle ever adopted by a standing army came from Mexico. This was the Mondragon Model 1908. Designed by General Manuel Mondragon, this thing was basically a spaceship compared to the bolt actions of its day. It used a gas-operated piston system, technology that is standard today, but in 1908, it was witchcraft. It was so advanced that when World War I broke out, the German Empire, desperate for firepower in the air, actually bought the design to arm their observers in biplanes. Imagine that, German soldiers fighting with Mexican technology. But it had a fatal flaw. It was built like a Swiss watch. It had tight tolerances and required high-quality ammunition. When you introduced it to the mud and grit of trench warfare, the watch stopped ticking. It was a brilliant failure, proof that in war you don't need perfection, you need reliability.
But while Mexico was looking at the future of military warfare, back in the States, a different kind of war was brewing on the streets. Before the AR-15 became the patrol rifle of choice for American law enforcement, there was the Winchester Model 1907. This wasn't designed for the trenches. It was a heavy hitter for the Prohibition era. This was the weapon that kept lawmen alive against motor bandits like the Dillinger Gang. Chambered in the punishing .351 Winchester self-loading cartridge, this rifle hit like a freight train, designed to punch through the steel bodies of getaway cars and turn cover into concealment. But here's the twist. It actually saw real combat. During World War I, the French bought thousands of these, slapped on extended magazines, and converted them to full auto. They called them trench sweepers. While the U.S. Army was fumbling with bolt actions, Winchester had already built a close-quarters nightmare. It was the spiritual grandfather of the modern assault rifle, serving faithfully in the shadows. The Winchester was a brute, but the U.S. military wanted something refined for the next global conflict. And that brings us to the Heartbreak Kid, the Johnson M1941. If the M1 Garand is the hero of the American story, the Johnson is the rival that almost took the crown. Designed by Melvin Johnson, a lawyer and Marine Reserve officer, this rifle arguably fixed every complaint soldiers had about the Garand. The Garand held 8 rounds, and you couldn't top it off mid-fight. The Johnson? It held 10 rounds in a rotary magazine, and you could load it with stripper clips anytime you wanted. Plus, it used a short recoil system that made the recoil impulse incredibly smooth. The U.S. Marine Corps loved this thing. In the early days of the Pacific Campaign, Paramarines took the Johnson into the jungles and swore by it. So why did it die? Politics and logistics. By the time the Johnson was ready, the U.S. industrial machine had already gone all in on the Garand. It was too late to switch gears. The Johnson M1941 wasn't a bad gun. It was just a victim of bad timing.
The Johnson died because of American politics. But across the ocean, another rifle was dying because it was simply too advanced for the soldiers holding it. This was the Soviet SVT-40. If you asked the Soviet soldier in 1941 what he wanted to carry, he'd say a Mosin Nagant, because he knew it would work. If you asked a German soldier what he wanted to carry, he'd say a captured Russian SVT-40. That's the irony of this weapon. The Soviets built this rifle to modernize the Red Army. It had a detachable 10-round magazine and a muzzle brake that made it loud as hell, but controllable. It was a beast. But the Soviet conscript army wasn't ready for it. It was complex to clean and maintain. If you didn't treat it right, it jammed. However, on the other side of the line, the Nazis, who were still stuck with bolt-action K98s, absolutely adored the captured SVTs. They prized them above their own weapons. It was a rifle that was hated by its creators, but loved by its enemies. In fact, the Germans loved the SVT so much, they didn't just use it, they stole the design. This leads us directly to the Gewehr 43. Early in the war, German military arrogance cost them dearly. They refused to drill gas ports into their barrels, thinking it would affect accuracy. The result was the disastrous Gewehr 41. After getting hammered by Russian semi-autos on the Eastern Front, German engineers swallowed their pride. They took the Russian gas system, slapped it onto a German receiver, and created the Gewehr 43. And it was actually pretty good. It was accurate, it accepted a scope easily, and it gave the Wehrmacht a fighting chance. But by the time it hit the field in numbers, the Third Reich was collapsing. The later production models show rough machining and cheap wood, signs of a desperate nation cutting corners. It was a solid design, born in the ashes of defeat. Germany was collapsing. But to the West, a nation often mocked for its military performance was quietly building a tank in the shape of a rifle. Enter the French MAS-49. Look at it. It's not winning any beauty contests. It's blocky, it's weird, and it's French. But looks can be deceiving. While the world was arguing about pistons, the French perfected the direct impingement system. That means the gas blows directly back into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. If that sounds familiar, it's because Eugene Stoner used a similar concept for the AR-15 decades later. The MAS-49 and its later variant, the 4956, served in the brutal conflicts of Indochina and Algeria. It was rugged, simple, and packed a serious punch. It's often forgotten because of the stigma surrounding the French military post-World War II, but ask anyone who's fired one, the MAS-49 is one of the most reliable semi-autos ever made. It just never got the Hollywood treatment.
The French proved simple is better, but head north to Scandinavia and things get complicated and painful. We're going to Sweden for the Lungman AG-42. The Swedes do things differently. When they wanted a semi-auto, they created a rifle that fired the flat-shooting 6.5mm round with laser-like precision. It used a direct gas tube system that was remarkably simple, but it had a dark side. It earned the nickname the Finger Eater. To load it, you didn't pull a charging handle back, you pushed the receiver cover forward. If you messed up the sequence while your fingers were in the action, the bolt would slam home under full spring tension. We're not talking about Garand thumb here, we're talking about shattered bone. Despite the danger to the operator, the mechanism was brilliant. The Egyptians actually bought the rights and produced the Hakim rifle based on this design. It was an engineer's dream, but a soldier's nightmare. While the Swedes were building finger traps, the Belgians were building a masterpiece. The final entry on our list isn't just a weapon, it's a work of art. The FN-49. I call this one the last aristocrat. In an era where stamped metal and plastic were starting to take over, the FN-49 was old-school elegance, beautiful wood, milled steel, built by the legendary WWII in Belgium. Sauvé actually had to hide the blueprints and flee to England during the Nazi occupation. When the war ended, he returned to Belgium to build it. It was robust, reliable, and accurate, but it was born tragic. It arrived just as the world was switching to select-fire assault rifles with detachable magazines. It was obsolete the day it was boxed up. But it wasn't a total loss. The lessons learned from the FN-49 went directly into Sauvé's next project, the FN-FAL, the right arm of the free world. The FN-49 died so the FAL could live. So there you have it. 8 rifles, 8 stories of innovation, bad timing, and brutal lessons learned. We remember the M1 Garand because it won the war. We remember the AK-47 because it changed the world. But these forgotten semi-autos, they were the stepping stones. Without the failures of the Mondragon, or the gas system of the SVT-40, with the direct impingement of the MAS-49, the modern rifles in your safe today might look very different. They were flawed, sure, but on the right day, in the right hands, they were just as deadly as the legends. Which one of these forgotten rifles would you trust your life with? Would you risk your thumb on the Swedish AG-42? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the armory, crush that like button and subscribe.